the big concern they have is Vladimir Putin winning the war, taking all of Ukraine, or just keeping the parts that he wants or something like that. And that then he might be like, oh, hey, I can get away with it. I'll take Poland or whatever.
Right.
Now, that to me seems very far-fetched. Like, he's having enough trouble just taking Ukraine. I really doubt he's moving on Poland next. But it's like, okay, I understand kind of in theory where that concern is. But what about the concern if he loses? Like, what if he's humiliated on his own border and Russia is completely destroyed and humiliated? What if like he's attacked within Russia? What then? What if he's convinced that he's done and he's going to be overthrown or he's going to die? To me, that's actually the most dangerous scenario, because really nobody's probably going to launch the first nuclear strike unless they're already convinced they're dead anyway. You know what I mean? And then it's like, all right, you're going to take me out, I'm bringing you with me type deal.
Right.
And to me, that's the biggest concern. What you want to find here is like an off-ramp where everyone can save face a little bit. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, everyone can go home and tell their own people, like, we did the job, you know? Like a justification somehow. And it really, it's got to involve like negotiating some type of compromise.
And you know, what if he does get overthrown and Russia becomes a failed state?
That's a pretty dangerous scenario too.
Imagine Russia becomes like Libya, because when they overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, Libya fell apart.
Yep.
They have open air slave markets where you can auction slaves off. You could watch them on YouTube. Libya is terrifying.
Well, that's why it's so crazy that, because you'll hear people like like Lindsey Graham and like idiots like that will talk about like if Putin's overthrown, like almost like it's a given that things are better then. And you're like, how? Even if it didn't go to like a failed state like Libya, like how do you know it's not just like a far worse right-wing dictator who comes up and takes over? You know what I mean? Like, why is it's not? If there's one thing we've learned from the 20th and 21st centuries, it's like sometimes you can overthrow a government and it can be much worse than the one that you overthrow. You know, governments were overthrown after World War I in Russia and Germany.
Yeah.
And then came in Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler, right? Like, it can get a lot worse, even if it's not a Gaddafi, failed state type deal, which is also much worse. But you could be looking at something, that's far worse than what we have right now.
But isn't it amazing that that's taken place so many times, and yet we still have this idea that overthrowing them or getting rid of our enemy that's the solution to the problem?
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
Even the fucking Game of Thrones kings handled it better.
Yeah, they really.
I mean, they fucking got together and worked shit out.
Here's when Obama said that the greatest regret of his presidency was not thinking about what would happen the day after they overthrew Gaddafi. And you're like, but you didn't. Like, we just did it in Iraq. You didn't.
Yeah,
that wasn't your thought.
You
didn't think maybe
it'll go crazy.
Yeah, this could.
Do
be
we
bad?
even have journalists in Libya now?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe. I don't know. I mean, they've done a few pieces on like the open air slave markets. I haven't seen anything in a few years.
But who's running Libya?
So I don't think anyone's running Libya. Libya is like basically warring tribes.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
And the only way someone's going to take control is the biggest warlord.
That's usually how it goes.
And what are their resources? Is it drugs? Sudan militants spark huge risk in lab with samples of deadly viruses. Oh, terrific.
Wonderful.
Terrific.
Wonderful.
We just happen to have deadly viruses laying around where there's a revolution.
You know, it's interesting if you go back and read these guys. Like I was talking about the Project for a New American Century. Have you heard of those that before? It was like
I've heard
a think
it from
tank.
you.
Yeah, It was a think tank in the 90s. It fueled a lot of, if the 9/11 conspiracy guys, like even some of the kooky guys, it fueled a lot of them because it was basically this, it was a think tank. Its founding signatories were like the Bush administration. It was all the neocons in the 90s who were out. So it was Robert Kagan and, Bill Kristol and Dick Cheney and, like all the Paul Wolfowitz, all the kind of like neocons who ended up taking power in George W. Bush's administration. And they laid out their plans for what they wanted to do. And one of their plans involved overthrowing Saddam Hussein in Iraq and fighting multiple wars and NATO expansion in Europe. And so the 9/11 conspiracy theorists would jump on this and go, aha, you know, this is why they brought the towers down, just so they could get the war in Iraq that they always wanted. Whereas I think the simpler explanation was just like they took advantage of the opportunity when it came and realized they could get what they wanted. But regardless, there's no debate. They're on record. They wanted it back in the 90s. And one of the so basically what it's about, it's what the title is. It's a project for a new American century. And they're like, hey, we're in the 90s here. The Soviet Union has fallen. The 20th century was the century of America. And now what's our plan for the next century? What's the plan for the new American century? And they actually say in one of the most famous policy papers, it's really something to say, is they go, look, we have no real threat to our vital interests right now, or no real threats to America, our dominance right now. And so what we need to do is fight wars in multiple theaters. So we need to go and now show our dominance to the rest of the world. And so they're actually saying, if you read between the lines, not that much, they're like, we don't need to fight a war, but let's go fight them. Let's go fight them anyway. And this is what happens. They won. Like all the wise people in government who were opposed to them lost, and all the dumb George W. Bushes and Joe Bidens won. And they got their way. And we're living through the results of it. And you're like, oh, great. Isn't this wonderful?
Do you remember when that general, was it
Wesley Clark.
Wesley Clark, that's right. Wesley Clark told this reporter in this interview that, like, find that interview because it's so fascinating.
You said 5 countries in 7 years, or
and
7
he was
countries
like,
in 5 years.
what are we doing?
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, he's this decorated general who's being presented with this plan. And let's play this because this has not been discussed enough.
This can never be discussed enough.
It can never be discussed enough. And it's all out there and you're not hearing it, you know, and this is the fact that journalists aren't like putting this in everyone's face. Well, this very information that you're giving out today.
Well, the good ones are, to be fair. I mean, like the Glenn Greenwalds and the Aaron Mateys and the Matt Taibbis, they're doing a great job on this stuff.
Coincidentally, all independent.
Yes, and coincidentally, all vilified by the establishment.
And weren't independent initially. These guys have all had to stick to their principles and leave to listen to this because this is very fucking wild.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?"